A pleasure, it's me all at last. And here we are again with some more films I should have talked about years ago. But in this instance, we have ourselves one that was pretty big, and believe it or not, was ultimately the reason why I started this whole thing. The Talk About It universe pretty much wouldn't have come around in 2021 had it not been for, get this, Godzilla vs. Kong, my initial reaction. This was actually the video I made in which that it set up the events for what I would eventually create an entire series based on movies that I could have talked about, and eventually movies that I have talked about. Long before the likes of the blackout period, in which that the YouTube channel was supposedly no more starting in 2013, and by 2018 I was able to bring it back. There was a lot of explanation I had to do to at least get people to understand what happened during those years in between, but that's a different story here. The point is, Godzilla vs. Kong was the sole reason why I decided to make these types of content. Films I should have talked about years ago, films I'm willing to talk about again, TV shows that deserve the spotlight, and more recently, video games that are totally awesome. Now, I plan on making more series like these in the future, so that's something else to consider down the line. Either way you look at it though, I've got plenty more things to say here because I intentionally didn't go into deep detail on Godzilla vs. Kong when I made my original video about it back when it came out on HBO Max. But we know that the film took itself a release 4 months earlier. So to speak, we have ourselves a mainly international release that took place by the end of 2020, and it at the time was considered to be one of the biggest films ever put to modern day pictures. And more importantly, when it came out on streaming platforms, especially HBO Max, which was the result of the mergers between a new system called Max as well as the HBO network. Godzilla vs. Kong came around at a walloping $470 million, which essentially was even higher than the breakpoint of $330 million, thus making it one of the highest grossing films at the time. And 2021 didn't exactly have all that much in terms of acclaimed films, though it had its share of memorable titles. Old, Nobody, and there was even a few MCU hits like Shang-Chi. But Godzilla vs. Kong was at the time considered to be one of the biggest films of the early portion of the slobbering 20s. And while the decade itself, having lived on for only 15 months by this point, since January 1st, 2020, of course, came around, Godzilla vs. Kong was still considered to be one of the biggest films ever made during that time. But by now, we have way more masterpieces to offer. Still, what does Godzilla vs. Kong have to offer? Well, first off, it's essentially a remake of the highly acclaimed King Kong vs. Godzilla, the unique monster mash of the East and the West merging together to fight and see who can be the victor. King Kong was seen as the unique giant ape of the United States, first being brought to New York from Skull Island and falling off the Empire State Building with his lady love interest, Ann Darrow, standing on top of the building, watching him fall after being gunned down by some planes. While Godzilla is seen as an unstoppable force of radioactive destruction with the ability to breathe nuclear rays from his mouth. So, on top of his massive size and enormous power and strength, you would think that they wouldn't work too well. But Toho went ahead and purchased a license to use King Kong for usage in a film that they intended to make based on a duo mashup, in a similar regard as to how the rest of the world, especially in Europe, was already uniquely interested in monster movies. There was, of course, the mashups between Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, and other well-known monsters of the classic Universal monster films. And while there would be many others like that later on, especially in the form of cartoons, there was hardly ever any known official live-action cinematic pieces of any super mega ultra popular monsters clashing together. There would, of course, be more popular examples later on, like Jason versus Freddy. That, of course, was one of the biggest, and it was also one of the most successful of the slasher film genre, in which that Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees duked it out multiple times. At first in the dream world, and then in the living world, in which it seemed like Jason was the victor due to him having Freddy's decapitated head in his hand. But Freddy winking at us meant he truly is eternal, as he seems to be. Anyways, though, I feel like I've talked a lot about this other stuff here, so Godzilla vs. Kong, here we go. The film starts us off taking place many years after the events of Kong Skull Island. We know that the opening scene of Kong vs. Skull Island took place during the kamikaze era of World War II, but then of course, a good 28 years would pass in which that the height of the Vietnam War would happen, by which I've always referred to as World War III. Especially when noting a lot of evidence has shown up about other things. So it wasn't just any war against a country like Vietnam. And it definitely wasn't the only country involved either. Anyways though, King Kong is now pretty old, if you can't already tell by his massive beard. The salt and pepper look, of course, is a unique accentuation to show us that King Kong has aged. Probably not in the best way, but the fact that he's still up and walking around and occasionally beating things up along the way, it goes to show that he is essentially looking for something. So, the many people out there happen to find him, and for the most part, there was, of course, the many things out there known as the Titans. It's important to note that when I talked about Godzilla King of the Monsters, which came out a little while before Godzilla vs. Kong, in May of 2019, there was of course that unique climax in which that King Ghidorah was finished off by Godzilla, and one of the three heads remained, in which that in an end credit scene, Charles Dance, or Alan Jonah basically, he essentially takes the head for his own usage. And what happens is that that same Ghidorah head is actually being used for a number of different experimentations, mainly through some unique form of telecommunication. This, of course, is a terrifying project in which that we get to see be brought to life in this very film. But before all that happens, we have King Kong, once again, with a number of different problems out there. There was, of course, Jia, a young child, whom eventually encounters Kong, and the two do seem to get along in a pretty unique way. So I guess you could say that at some point during the plots of the other films, King Kong had been getting along with some human child, I guess in a similar way as to how King Kong had bonded with another human, Andero. I mean, like I said, whether it be in the original, in which that Andero was played by Fay Wray, and in the 2005 Peter Jackson remake where she was played by Naomi Watts, the thing is that Jia comes pretty close. Jia doesn't exactly possess nearly the kind of dastardly beauty as Andero would have, but still, the one thing that does allow for Kong to bond with Jia so well is because he apparently knows sign language. Yeah, doesn't that remind you of something? A few years ago, there was a Dwayne Johnson film based on a certain video game from the 80s called Rampage. And I kid you not, the gorilla character, he could actually speak sign language. Yeah. I wonder if they took inspiration from that film to have King Kong speak sign language. It's a unique paradigm shift, but at the same time, it truly reminds you of something along the way. I mean, even in the 1995 film Born to Be Wild, we have a similar thing going on. Well, I'm probably just overthinking it. It's true that some apes and gorillas can communicate via sign language, which is a unique thing to have, but still. There's just a lot of reminders I'm getting here, and a lot of references. But anyways, though, what eventually happens is that while they're trying to find a home for King Kong due to all this stuff that's been going on with him, we do get some shots of the ever so powerful Godzilla. And remember, he was practically empowered by that explosive device inside of his cave, his lair, if you will. When Dr. Serizawa blew himself up, Godzilla essentially became more powerful than the entire team of Monarch realized. And it's also important to note that there would also be a series titled Monarch, in which that they would follow Godzilla in many ways. Now, to be honest with you, I don't quite know if Monarch has anything to do with the plot, or if it actually does offer any plot points for the franchise. But the thing is that the cast itself is very different from the last films. I mean, it was one thing where Kong Skull Island took place in the 70s and had different cast members, but with the two Godzilla films up until now, they both took place somewhere in the present time, compared to Skull Island, which took place many years before. But in this film, we have a whole different cast. Of course, we'll mention that Alexander Skarsgård, a brother of Bill Skarsgård, he actually plays our main protagonist, Dr. Lind. And we also do get a return of Millie Bobby Brown playing Madison Russell, the daughter of Mark and Emma Russell, both highly acclaimed doctors, and played by the likes of Kyle Chandler and Vera Farmiga, respectively. But then, of course, there is Kaylee Hoddle. Hoddle, of course, plays Gia, the sign language communicating child who bonds with Kong. But the thing is that in this instance, heading back to Godzilla, there eventually comes to a point where a massive clash goes down, and there's also a world that gets explored. I mean, the fact that Monarch ends up discovering some sort of world that's deep, deep underground, with the help of a few faces, as well as some technology from the Monarch organization, they're able to discover this world as being deep underground and essentially towards the center of the Earth. So, a journey to the center of the Earth. How many references to other movies are we gonna get here? Like, again, I've talked about a ton of films over the years. Am I losing it at this point? I don't even know. Anyways, though, this world supposedly has interconnections to the likes of all the Titan appearances on Earth. And as we had learned from Monarch-based lore over the years, especially in the events of Kong Skull Island and the two Godzilla films, there were all these talks about all these kaijus coming around from a certain location, but now we have the actual introduction and the plot to take us to that world directly. So it's unique that we finally get a good glimpse of what this world is like, where all these kaiju are coming from. Godzilla might have originated from there, Kong might have come from there, the Mutos might have come from there, and the likes of King Ghidorah, Mothra, Rodan, and everything else that we've seen up to this point has been coming from this one world. But you know what, though? It's okay and all that stuff. It's a unique world worth exploring, kind of in a similar regard as to how the Journey films, with Journey to the Center of the Earth and Journey to the Mysterious Island, this is a kind of film that demands a lot of exploration, a feast for the eyes and for the ears as well, because the soundtrack also gives us a unique glimpse into what to expect from this. Because I will say that it's worth mentioning that across each film, the soundtracks are composed by different people. In this case, Godzilla vs. Kong, the soundtrack was composed by Junkie XL. Now, Junkie XL was already known for creating the soundtrack for Sonic the Hedgehog, and would do the same thing for the next two films, which would come out in 2022 and 2024. But in this case, we have a Godzilla film and a King Kong film that are all put together by a unique DJ. So, I mean, apart from having Bear McCreary in the second Godzilla film and Henry Jackman in Kong Skull Island, and there was also a different guy who did work for the first Godzilla film. So it seems that with every new installment we get a different composer. It's understandable when you think about it, because there's a lot going on with some of these guys, and some people will have business elsewhere at the time that they produce other films. So I guess it does make sense that they couldn't keep around. Bear McCreary especially did a fantastic job handling Godzilla King of the Monsters. And Junkie XL, though, also does pretty nice around here, accentuating the theming and the tone of this film alongside the action as well as the many other scenes that take place here. But one important thing to note in the plot is that Godzilla becomes purple. Oh man. And the massive amounts of atomic breath that comes out is enough to clear a massive pathway in which that King Kong is eventually brought up. And this especially happens when Kong himself actually creates a dorsal fin axe. Somehow they were able to harvest one of Godzilla's dorsal fins, and they were able to help create a weapon for Kong to use to fight against them. And once they got back up to the surface, and the teams that were essentially scattered all over the place because of certain accidents that happened, and a lot of exploration had to take place. That's essentially what a majority of things happen in the film's plot, in which an accident occurs, the team of survivors rounds things up, and eventually helps Kong fight Godzilla. So we have ourselves a monster mash of a lifetime, and Kong is wielding a weapon and going up against Godzilla. That's actually pretty advantageous. He hardly had anything to help against Godzilla's destructive force in King Kong versus Godzilla, so in this instance, giving him an actual weapon to fight with Godzilla, especially when it's made out of part of his body, it's like giving Godzilla a taste of his own medicine. Oh, but the purple that we saw in Godzilla will actually become more prevalent in the sequel, The New Empire, which I'll get to in a little bit. Anyways, though, when the fight basically seems like it's evenly matched with Godzilla and King Kong even roaring at each other's faces, and man is it insane. I mean, just the fact that you have them both exhibiting their massive vocalizations at each other, it really shows that it's a tough call to determine who is the true victor here. Oh, but surprise, surprise, a third challenger comes around. But unlike what happened when the PlayStation was able to overtake the likes of the Nintendo and Sega consoles, Mechagodzilla, basically a Neuro Brain Link with that one King Ghidorah head that Alan Jonah essentially put together. This unfortunately was some sort of project that would in fact turn out to be left with a pretty bad weakness. Something that actually feels pretty anticlimactic. I mean, you remember when I talked about the ending of Avatar Fire and Ash? Well, let's just say that the climax in this massive fight against the Mechagodzilla and the original Godzilla and King Kong, and the fact that they tag team together to fight this massive robot is one thing, and I will say that the design is a little wonky for what it is. I mean, they could have done something similar like the Ready Player One version of Mechagodzilla. It actually looked very close to the design of Godzilla himself. But I guess I can't complain about it too much, because this Mechagodzilla is pretty well armed. I mean, having grappling hooks for hands, a drill bit tail, some lasers, and a lot of potential to kill both kaiju. But had it not been for the character spilling coffee on the computer, like what? That's how you destroy Mechagodzilla? Well, actually no, that's not really what happened, but it actually did cause Mechagodzilla to short out because the electrical interference with the coffee caused it to short circuit and make him vulnerable from Godzilla and King Kong's attacks. So let's get this straight here. Unlike the last films in which that the climaxes were because of the almighty force of Godzilla's heat rays and other such abilities, and King Kong's unique abilities, now we have an antagonist that is easily defeated because of coffee of all things. Yeah. Talk about a reduction in my final score. So, much like Avatar Fire and Ash, I will say that this is probably even worse for a climax. Because why the heck would they do that? I mean, it's understandable when you think about it. Mechagodzilla was a little too powerful for Godzilla and King Kong to handle, so I guess they had to come up with something. They couldn't just shut down Mechagodzilla or slow him down or distract him. No. They had to use coffee and dump it all over the computer. If there's one thing that most of us film viewers will not like, it's anticlimaxes. It's the complete opposite of what people want to see. They want Godzilla to fight with his own wits And when Godzilla fought Mechagodzilla multiple times, it was usually only him who won. Little to no human intervention, little to no assistance from other kaiju, just Godzilla's own force. That's what made him a force to be reckoned with. A king of the monsters. But here, he and King Kong are evenly matched, only for a third guy to show up and get shorted out from human intervention, making Godzilla and King Kong now both able to defeat this new threat. And apart from the fact that Mechagodzilla has only been on screen for a little while, compared to how much of screen time he had gotten over the years, you know what? It's probably not worth it to go into as much detail as I normally would have, because these kind of subjects aren't exactly meant to be taken seriously all that much. Sometimes there's Godzilla films that just introduce a bit of comedy to them, even if it's a little dark. But still, what kind of climax is that? So overall, Nadea's won. Both Godzilla and King Kong go their separate ways, and Monarch, once again, has some more work to figure out here. Apart from all the mishaps that went down in that world that was explored earlier, this realm of the Titans, we do go into more greater detail on it in the sequel, which would come out 4 years later in 2024. Like I said, I will talk about that in greater detail. But anyways, Godzilla vs. Kong in this instance, having rewatched it a while ago, it's a lot better than what I had originally remembered. I did not figure that so much was wrong with it here. It was a great way to reboot the original film, but that climax especially is what hurts it. Spilling coffee just to short out a giant robot. I mean, come on. That'd be like me swatting a fly. Come on. That's not how this works. So, for my final scoring of Godzilla vs. Kong, it's definitely nowhere near perfect for what it is, especially with that climax. So, 8.1 out of 10.1 for that. And yeah, that's just what it is. But don't worry, because I'm not quite done with this yet. We have Godzilla and Kong, the New Empire, to talk about tomorrow. So stick around for that moment, and I will be there to talk about that very film. See you guys later.